Okay, let's unpack this. We have a genuinely comprehensive stack of material today. It's it's mapping out the great moral and philosophical tensions that are not just defining the 21st century, but, well, they're demanding urgent resolution.
This is a deep dive into the very core of human endeavor. We're looking at a sprawling battlefield of ideas. It spans everything from the most intimate questions of our own genetics to the massive global structures that govern things like food security and international law.
Right. And our mission today is to move beyond just chronicling scientific achievements. We're plunging into contemporary bioethics and all of its adjacent fields, sports, agriculture, geopolitics, to really get a handle on the complex arguments, the logical reasoning, and, well, the profound battlegrounds where principle clashes with practical reality.
And if there is one concept, just one, that ties every single one of these seemingly disparate topics together, it is aporia. Yeah. It's an ancient Greek term. It translates, more or less, to a logical impasse, a state of profound puzzlement. And what we find so fascinating is how often our technical capability just sprints ahead of our philosophical consensus. It leaves humanity facing these really difficult aporias across almost every domain we're going to look at. We know what we can do, but we haven't agreed on whether we should.
Exactly. So we're going to begin by examining that foundational tension between pure science and utilitarian human values. Then we'll transition to the moral status of genetic modification and the failure of consensus on human cloning.
From there, we'll challenge the traditional anthropocentric view of our relationship with non-human living beings. We'll also analyze the promise versus the deception in global agriculture and GMOs.
And then we'll look at the surprising depths of ethics in competitive sports before closing things out with a look at globalization. Is it truly integration, or is it a new form of recolonization?
A huge landscape to cover.
It is. So let's start at the beginning. We have to start where the modern scientific project truly began. We're talking about Francis Bacon. He essentially gave modern science its marching orders, didn't he? He established the philosophical roots that, you could argue, still dictate funding and research focus today.
Absolutely. Bacon's view, outlined in works like The New Organon, it established a very clear purpose for the whole enterprise. He stated that the true purpose of science is its practical use. To quote him, to endow human life with new discoveries and resources.
So the goal is practical benefit.
The goal is practical benefit. It meant achieving nothing less than the dominion of man over nature. This mandate improving human life, reducing suffering, giving humanity power, that's the engine that has driven innovation for centuries.
And that practical benefit is undeniably what attracts political and economic support. I mean, if science can cure a disease or deliver a technological advantage, it gets funding. Simple as that.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The sources reveal a crucial subtlety, a tension that's inherent in Bacon's own writings that we consistently overlook in the modern era.
Wow.
Bacon also argued that contemplating things as they are seeking pure, untainted truth, what we might call science for its own sake, is inherently worthier than all the practical upshot.
Worthier, so better.
Yeah, a higher calling. He viewed the practical acts more as mere pledges of truth, rather than the ultimate role itself. He outright rejected harsh pragmatism.
So even the architect of the scientific revolution saw this hierarchy, where the pursuit of truth was actually higher than the pursuit of power. In our modern hyper-utilitarian context, how drastically have we inverted that hierarchy?
Oh, completely. I mean, modern funding models, research focuses, they systematically neglect that pure search for truth, the kind of curiosity-driven research that doesn't have an immediate marketable output.
Yeah.
We've prioritized the Baconian mandate for dominion over the Baconian value for wonder, and that disconnect leads directly to Werner Heisenberg's powerful insight centuries later.
Right. Heisenberg steps in to remind us of the obvious, yet somehow constantly forgotten fact that science is fundamentally human.
Science is made by men, he wrote. It's a seemingly self-evident truth, but it highlights that the scientific endeavor is inseparable from conversation, and so it's inseparable from human, philosophical, political, and moral problems.
It's not this purely objective, disembodied process operating in a vacuum.
Not at all. It's rooted in subjective human choices and values through and through.
And because science is rooted in human choices, it carries this inherent ambiguity. The dual-use dilemma.
It's unavoidable. Just look at fields like genetics, virology, or atomic physics. The exact same scientific achievement that tends toward progress and achieving the highest human values can, at the same time, generate adverse, even catastrophic consequences.
It's the same tool.
It's the same tool. The tool itself is neutral. The morality lies entirely in the hand that wields it.
Which circles us back to the question of control and responsibility. There is a strong cynical view, you see it notably from Herbert Marcuse, that the scientific and technical process has grown so large and complex that it is fundamentally out of our control. It's just leaving our fate to coincidence.
And our source material really pushes back against that absolute cynicism. It argues that control is possible, but it requires a conscious, critical awareness of responsibility from every scientist, every funder, every policymaker.
So it's not a technical problem, it's a human one.
Exactly. This responsibility has to be the starting point of any scientific act, coupled with a full awareness of potential abuses. The imbalance we see today is precisely because we've invested disproportionately high amounts in practical application while neglecting the fundamental research into pure science, ethics, and the humanities, the fields that foster that critical awareness.
It's so interesting to contrast this utilitarian focus with the original Greek motivation for intellectual inquiry. What did the ancients seek?
They sought wonder, or thaumazein. As Aristotle noted, science and philosophy began with wonder, an appreciation for the unusual phenomena of the cosmos, the celestial bodies, the universe itself.
And the goal.
Purely knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It was a search for truth that wasn't burdened by the expectation of utility or some technological upshot. It was inherently an act of appreciation, not an act of dominion.
And the dominance of that utilitarian focus has effectively eclipsed that original sense of wonder, which leads us directly into what the source calls the modern crisis. Edmund Husserl identified this as the positivistic restriction of science.
Yes. Husserl observed that by restricting science to what is empirically measurable and practically useful, specifically human questions, questions of meaning, purpose, and value, were banned from the realm of science.
Banned. That's a strong word.
It is, and when science voluntarily gave up the pursuit of these deeper questions, it lost its leadership role in shaping European humanity, a role it had held since the Renaissance.
This restriction solidified the foundations of the modern homocentric world image, which was built on Aristotle's definitions of man. Can you detail those for us, how they set us against nature?
Certainly. Aristotle defined man in 3 ways that really established his distinct place. First, man is the only being with logos. Now that translates not just to speech, but also to reason.
Okay, logos is reason. What's the second?
Second, man is the only being who can differentiate good and evil, which establishes the basis for justice.
And third?
Third, man is a political animal. These definitions placed man in a sphere separate from and ultimately superior to the rest of nature. This anthropocentric worldview led to technological and developmental progress that was achieved in opposition to nature rather than in harmony with it.
And the consequences of this opposition, this belief in infinite dominion, are now manifesting on a global scale.
Right. We face a new moral situation where the negative consequences, climate change, biodiversity loss, technological risk, they're not the result of a single evil person's actions.
No.
They are a collective act, or as Husserl called it, the consequence of anonymous functioning subjectivity. It is the result of millions of disconnected, rational utility decisions adding up to a global catastrophe. We now face a nature that has begun to vigorously protest, demanding cooperation and responsibility.
So the bioethical mandate that has to follow from this is one of profound long-term responsibility.
Exactly. It crystallizes into Hans Jonas's mandate. We should not compromise the conditions for an indefinite continuation of humanity on Earth. And this requires a holistic, multidisciplinary approach that bioethically codifies the social responsibility of scientists, demanding they maintain humanistic moral principles and scientific criticality.
With the scientific community.
The scientific community, Jonas argues, cannot operate below the achieved civilization standards of ethical culture. The search for truth must include the wisdom necessary to apply that truth responsibly.
Moving from those foundational principles, let's look at a domain where that principle versus utility tension is most acutely felt. Genetics. We're talking about hereditary genetic modifications, or HGMs. Before we get into the ethics, we need to be crystal clear on what kind of intervention we are actually discussing.
That distinction is paramount. Most genetic interventions performed today fall under somatic cell therapy.
Somatic.
Yes. This involves making interventions on non-reproductive cells, like treating liver cells or bone marrow cells, to cure a patient of a disease. Crucially, that modification dies with the patient. It cannot be passed on.
But hereditary genetic modifications, HGMs or germinal therapy, are completely different.
Completely different. This involves interventions that alter the genome of gametes, so sperm or egg or the embryo itself. The change is permanent and it is transferable to all subsequent offspring. And this is why it raises such immediate and profound philosophical questions, because the effects are intergenerational and, well, irreversible.
From a purely medical standpoint, though, the case for HGMs is incredibly compelling. What are the advantages that are driving the research?
The theoretical medical advantages are persuasive, no doubt. First, it offers the possibility of permanently preventing the inheritance of crippling diseases. You'd avoid the necessity of repeating expensive, complex somatic therapy generation after generation.
That's a big one.
It is. Second, intervening at the zygote or embryo stage allows researchers to prevent irreversible damage that might occur during fetal development. And third, proponents argue that over many generations and carefully regulated, it could potentially reduce the burden of hereditary diseases in the human gene pool.
That sounds like a technical dream come true.
But the moral and philosophical objections are immediate, and they're often rooted in this concept of inviolability.
Indeed. The argument from inviolability states that human genes deserve a special status because they are the core blueprint of humanity, and therefore that pre-excludes germinal intervention on principle.
But if we follow the ethical principle of beneficence of doing good, we run into a counter-argument. If genes are causing profound suffering or death, do they really possess an intrinsic, untouchable value? Their value is derived based on their function. So if we can prevent harm, does the present generation have a moral obligation to repair them?
And that's the core tension right there. Abstract inviolability versus concrete beneficence.
Exactly. And this relates to the concept of genetic heritage, the idea that future generations have a right to an unmodified gene pool.
The gene pool as a kind of commonwealth.
That's the assertion, yeah. A natural resource that we are managing for our descendants. However, a rigorous critique reveals that the human gene pool is, and this is a great phrase, a heuristic abstraction.
A heuristic abstraction, what does that mean?
It means it's a useful concept, but not a concrete thing. It's constantly flowing, constantly evolving, and fundamentally unmanaged in the way a forest or a river might be. Individuals inherit genes from their parents, not from some collective human germination line. So trying to preserve an unmodified state is both scientifically impossible and philosophically confusing, as there is no fixed ideal state to return to.
The truly difficult ethical puzzle here, the intergenerational aporia, is the problem of consent. I mean, the future people whose lives we are fundamentally altering cannot consent to those changes.
This is the most profound challenge. The present generation is making decisions with irreversible biological consequences for people who do not yet exist. So what is the nature of our obligation to them? Is it to preserve their freedom by giving them a chance at an unmodified state, or is it to maximize their well-being by ensuring they don't inherit a crippling condition?
We're forced to choose between an abstract right to autonomy, which they can't even exercise, and the concrete potential for health and quality of life.
Exactly. And this is precisely where we see the steep and frankly terrifying slide toward eugenics. It's not just a theoretical concern, it's a direct societal risk tied to justice.
How so?
The risk is immense. If this technology is privatized, and all new high technology tends to be, the rich will capitalize on genetic modification to give their offspring a better nature, creating a dangerous new dimension of natural inequality.
So we'd be deepening the economic gap by adding a biological gap.
Precisely, increasing prejudice against those with special needs. We must never forget the historical context. The eugenics movements of the 1930s, they used arbitrary metrics like IQ tests to justify forced sterilizations, discrimination, and ultimately the atrocities of Operation T4 in Nazi Germany.
History shows us the danger of allowing technology to enforce a single definition of normality.
Yes, the normalcy trap. The concern is that if technology allows us to correct or enhance traits, society will quickly impose a harmful or distorted perception of normality. It would make any deviation physical, intellectual, psychological, undesirable. It could increase pressure and prejudice against those with differences. The pressure on parents would be immense.
And the distinction between therapeutic correction and outright enhancement becomes impossibly blurry, doesn't it?
It is the ethical tightrope walk. The ability to correct a gene that predisposes someone to Alzheimer's disease immediately grants the technical ability to improve memory far beyond the current human baseline.
So the tools are identical.
Often, yes. The source insists that if HGMs are used, they must be exclusively therapeutic. But that's the great policy challenge. How can society balance scientific freedom, because the research itself has to continue, with the responsibility of preventing the slide toward designer babies, social inequality, and new forms of eugenics? The technology is morally neutral, but its application is inherently political and social.
Okay, so if the genetic modification debate is about a future possibility, the human cloning debate is a perfect case study in a present failure of global consensus. It shows how a principled consensus like banning reproductive cloning can fail spectacularly when you try to translate it into a unified legal reality.
The 2005 UN Declaration on Human Cloning serves as the prime example of this cultural civilizational aporia. The initial goal, which was spearheaded by France and Germany, was actually really straightforward: a quick, clear convention banning reproductive cloning.
That's not what happened.
Not at all. What actually happened was the debate immediately broadened. It moved away from the narrow bioethical question of reproductive cloning, where there was general moral agreement, to the status of the embryo itself. And this just dragged in all these deeply divisive issues like therapeutic cloning, research cloning, the moment human life begins, abortion, fundamental human rights.
The whole can of worms.
The whole can of worms. The result was 4 years of intense political fracturing. The initial goal of a unified legal ban was completely undermined by compromise. It exposed these deep fault lines across international law and religious views. And the final declaration, a non-binding, complex document, is a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity.
Let's dissect that ambiguity, because that's the key insight here. Look at the wording of paragraph A, which urged member states to protect adequately human life in the context of life sciences.
That seemingly innocent phrase was the first major sticking point. Total ban supporters argued that human life meant the embryo should be protected fully, thereby banning all forms of cloning, including research cloning.
But the opposition?
The opposition countries like Belgium, which were heavily invested in stem cell research, feared this would implicitly grant the embryo full legal personhood. The insertion of the adverb adequately was an attempt to soften the requirement, suggesting protection should be proportional to the stage of development. In the end, it satisfied neither side. It became purely rhetorical.
Then we have the absolute masterpiece of linguistic neutrality in paragraph B. This was the part meant to prohibit cloning. It prohibited all forms of cloning, but only inasmuch as they are incompatible with human dignity.
That phrase, inasmuch as, completely gutted the declaration's intended force. It functions as a legal loophole.
How so?
Well, if the phrase means because or since, it implies all cloning is inherently a violation of dignity. But if it means if, or to the extent that, it implies that states have the authority to decide if therapeutic cloning is compatible with dignity.
So countries could just pick the interpretation they preferred.
And they did. Countries that wanted to permit research cloning, like the UK, simply adopted the latter interpretation. It rendered the prohibition meaningless for their domestic policy.
It's fascinating how the failure to define fundamental ethical concepts like human dignity just led to total political paralysis.
Dignity was the ethical football. Opponents of cloning relied heavily on the Kantian definition of intrinsic value, not treating persons, or potential persons, merely as means to an end. They feared cloning would treat offspring or embryos as objects for research or desire. But because the declaration failed to offer a specific, legally binding definition of dignity, the concept just remained an abstract principle, easily invoked by both sides but politically unbound.
And the political fracturing was absolute, even among close geopolitical allies.
Oh, look at the voting record. The UK, a global leader in stem cell research, had major economic and scientific reasons to oppose a total ban. They argued consensus should be reached domestically. The U.S., on the other hand, driven by powerful domestic pro-life movements, strongly supported a total ban. They interpreted the declaration as a clear commitment to the sanctity of human life.
So you had historical allies voting diametrically against each other.
Completely. Even the initial proponents, France and Germany, ended up disagreeing entirely on the interpretation of the final text.
And this global divergence was further underscored by paragraph F, which was proposed by African states, and it changed the entire dynamic.
It really did. This paragraph revealed the massive disparity in global priorities. It called on member states to consider the urgency of addressing global health issues like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, rather than focusing all the debate and funding on cloning research, which primarily concerned wealthy nations.
Oh.
It was a profound moment. It demonstrated that while the West was arguing over the philosophical status of the embryo, a vast portion of the world was concerned with immediate lethal epidemics. The UN Declaration ultimately became a lesson that political, economic, cultural, and religious factors significantly influence, and often just override, expert bioethical consensus.
The ethical tension we've been discussing pivots now to the moral status of other living beings. Historically, our Western legal and philosophical traditions have been fiercely anthropocentric. Rights and dignity are exclusive to humans, following figures like Kant and Aristotle.
Right. And that long-standing tradition is facing its most serious challenge yet from the pathocentric view. It's championed by thinkers like Peter Singer, Tom Regan, and Klaus Michael Meyerowitz, and they argue that moral consideration must be expanded beyond the human species.
And the fundamental question underpinning that pathocentric view is the famous query posed by Jeremy Bentham: can they suffer?
Precisely. If animals are sentient, if they're capable of experiencing pain, fear, and pleasure, and possess interests and needs similar to humans, like the need to avoid suffering, then the principle of equality demands that their interests be respected equally to similar human interests. Singer refers to certain animals as having personalities, and Regan insists they are subjects of life. The ability to suffer, rather than the ability to reason, becomes the benchmark for moral inclusion.
However, even within those pathocentric arguments, the traditional hierarchy of value often remains surprisingly durable when push comes to shove. This is perfectly illustrated by Tom Regan's lifeboat thought experiment.
It's a classic ethical dilemma. Imagine a packed lifeboat. There are several humans and one dog present, and one must be sacrificed to save the rest.
Okay.
Despite advocating for animal rights, Regan reluctantly concludes that the dog must be sacrificed. And why? Because the loss of life opportunities and future experiences is determined to be greater for the human than for the dog, who has more modest possibilities of experience.
So even for the animal rights advocate, the human life takes precedence.
It shows that in moments of severe, unavoidable conflict, the primacy of man and the conventional hierarchy of values remain unchanged.
This highlights the central philosophical difficulty. How do you grant rights without automatically granting moral equality or demanding equal duties?
And this is where Leonard Nelson provides the crucial systematic bridge. Kant argued that only beings capable of autonomous moral decision-making could hold rights. Nelson challenged this. He said the requirement that a rights holder must also be a subject of duty is overly restrictive. Nelson argued that any being with interests is a person in the moral sense, deserving the right to respect for those interests.
Which allows you to include animals as right holders even though they can't make contracts or assume moral responsibility.
Exactly. So expanding human dignity can paradoxically be achieved by recognizing our responsibility to animals.
How does that work?
Johannes Kaspar argues exactly that. He posits that modern human dignity includes responsibility and empathy for creatures that humans have made dependent. When we restrict human freedom, for instance, by banning cruel farming practices, that restriction actually benefits the dignity of the human agent. The greater the animal's dependence on us, the more urgent and actual our responsibility becomes.
Let's look at how this tension plays out in a real legal system, like Serbia's law on animal welfare. How does a modern state attempt to legislate this moral duty?
It's a great example. The Serbian law uses the pathocentric concept of the universality of pain and establishes a clear moral obligation on man to protect animals. But this protection is legally indirect. Animals are explicitly not legal subjects. They can't sue, and they don't possess the dignity of personality as defined by the Constitution. This means the protection is a duty placed upon the moral agent, man, not a right held by the animal.
And because of the hierarchy of laws, this moral duty often collapses when it conflicts with fundamental human interests.
It does, every time. The legal structure prioritizes constitutional rights. So freedoms such as the freedom of scientific research or economic activity like running a large-scale farm override lower-ranking animal welfare laws. Article 15 of the Serbian law explicitly permits the killing of animals for food or scientific purposes. So despite setting high ethical ideals in welfare legislation, economic necessity and fundamental human constitutional rights retain absolute priority.
This leads to the radical, non-anthropocentric challenge: the demand for constitutional rights for animals, specifically dignity and a life appropriate to their species.
And this is the utopian demand. If animals were granted fundamental constitutional rights, the societal impact would be revolutionary. It would immediately necessitate the abolition of massive factory farming, the restriction of many forms of scientific research, maybe even challenge the practice of pet ownership.
Implementing an animal's right to life in a meat-eating society would demand a programmatic shift in eating habits for new generations.
It's an enormous moral undertaking.
So ultimately, the source settles on a position that tries to balance these concerns.
It does. It reflects the traditional ethical view while recognizing the need for practical change. Moral status, the source concludes, belongs only to man, since man is the only being who can act morally, make autonomous decisions, and assume responsibility. Therefore, while strengthening legal protection and welfare measures is crucial, taking care of animal dignity remains entirely man's task, an extension of human moral self-awareness and responsibility, rather than an inherent, enforceable legal right of the animal itself.
Let's shift our attention now from individual moral status to global justice, poverty, and technological control. We'll do that through the lens of genetically modified crops, or GMOs. To understand the context, we must first look at the legacy of the Green Revolution.
Right. The Green Revolution of the mid-20th century was hailed as a savior. By utilizing intensive hybrids, massive irrigation, and nitrogen fertilizers, it achieved incredible success, particularly in Asia. It tripled yields and helped nations like India achieve self-sufficiency.
But those successes came at a steep cost, which really set the stage for the next technological wave.
The failures were massive. Geographically, Africa was largely left behind. Ecologically, the revolution created an utter dependence on chemical inputs, which led to mass soil erosion and, critically, a catastrophic loss of biodiversity. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that about 75% of global genetic diversity has been lost in the last century, as local varieties were replaced by just a few high-yield hybrids.
And economically.
Economically, it increased inequality, favoring large landowners who could afford the irrigation systems and chemicals.
So now we have transgenics, which proponents promised would solve the Green Revolution's failures. But transgenics are fundamentally different from traditional selective breeding.
No, they are. Traditional breeding involves selecting desirable traits within the same or closely related species. You're working within nature's existing genetic flow. Transgenic organisms, GMOs, introduce genes from totally unrelated species, circumventing natural barriers. These foreign genes often come from bacteria, viruses, or insects, fundamentally altering the genetic makeup in ways that are impossible through natural processes.
And the promise was dazzling. Better nutrition, higher resistance, feeding the starving world.
The optimistic projections included incredible things. Resistance to specific diseases, like the feathery mottle virus and sweet potato, enhanced nutritional value, like gold rice engineered to contain carotene and iron. There was even talk of pharmaceutical applications like vaccines delivered via bananas. The promise was that these crops would adapt to degraded soils and provide essential nutrients to vulnerable populations.
But the reality, the deception, seems to be that the technology was primarily captured by corporate interests, solving commercial problems rather than global poverty.
That is the core critique. Look at what is actually cultivated. The four most dominant GM crops, soybean, maize, cotton, and canola, are overwhelmingly herbicide resistant. As of 2019, 43% of the total GM area was designed specifically to resist herbicides.
And who does that benefit?
This modification primarily benefits multinational companies who sell the patented crop seed, the patented gene, and the matching herbicide. It is an exercise in monopolistic control over the agricultural chain, not necessarily a solution to technical scarcity.
The ethical concerns here extend beyond commercial dominance to health and environmental risks.
Health failures have occurred, sometimes dramatically. An early example was a soybean project where a gene from the Brazil nut was introduced. Because the nut is a known allergen, the genetically modified soybean also caused allergic reactions, forcing the project's immediate withdrawal.
And environmentally?
Environmentally, the primary concern is the threat to biodiversity, particularly in the centers of origin of plants, where gene flow through cross-pollination could endanger the indigenous relatives of major crops, wiping out natural resistance.
This concentration of power leads to the bioethical critique against the patenting of living organisms.
The source argues that patenting living organisms is bioethically unacceptable. It represents a philosophical attempt to achieve domination over life itself, treating nature and even human-designed life forms as mere commodities. When you measure it against the four core principles of bioethics, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and beneficence, the current commercially driven production model for GMOs is deeply problematic.
This brings us to the Malthusian myth, the primary justification used by GMO proponents. The idea that population growth will inevitably outstrip food supply.
And we must directly challenge this premise with statistics, because the data is damning. The world currently produces an overwhelming abundance of food. Global production reached 2.77 billion tons of cereal in 2020, and production growth at 2% annually is outpacing population growth, which is at 1.05% annually.
So we make more than enough food.
More than enough. Globally, enough food exists to provide every single person on the planet with about 3,500 calories per day, enough to make the global population obese.
So the incredible tragic irony is that despite this abundance, 690 million people are still starving and 2 billion face food uncertainty. The issue is not technical scarcity at all.
Not in the slightest. The problem is fundamentally social, economic, and political. As the World Bank famously concluded, the issue is the redistribution of the buying power and the resources in favor of the undernourished ones. If poor people cannot afford to buy the food, increasing production only increases the amount of food that is wasted or converted into bioethanol for wealthier nations.
The problem is inequality.
The problem is social inequality and agrarian strategy, not production volume. The promise of GMOs as the great hope for the hungry remains, for the world's poor, a great deception.
We've just analyzed how commercial and political interests override ethical principles on the massive scale of global food supply. Now let's make a sharp pivot to the individual level, looking at competitive sports, which surprisingly mirrors the exact same failure of ethical principle.
It's an excellent transition because competitive sport, at its essence, is a microcosm of human ethical systems. Sport is defined as a physical, competitive activity aimed at well-being, social interaction, and performance, all conducted in the spirit of sportsmanship. And the framework is critical, specifically the distinction between the two types of rules.
Okay, so we have the constitutive rules and the sportsmanship rules.
Right. Constitutive rules are the technical ones. They define the game. You score a goal this way. You can't use your hands in soccer. They are governed by official bodies like FIFA. Sportsmanship rules, however, are the unwritten moral code. Honor, honesty, respect, and crucially, the intent to increase the opponent's enjoyment and ensure they reach their highest level of competition.
And what are the four essential moral values that underpin sportsmanship?
They are justice, honesty, responsibility, and beneficence. Justice is multifaceted. You have distributive justice, procedural, retributive, and compensatory. Responsibility means the athlete is accountable for their actions, and beneficence requires the athlete not just to avoid harming the opponent, but actively to do good or remove harm.
But it seems the prevailing utilitarian commercialized ethos of modern sports has largely jettisoned that beneficence aspect.
Oh, absolutely. While elite athletes generally agree they shouldn't intentionally injure an opponent, they aggressively reject the idea that their task is to help the opponent or actively do good. The prevailing attitude, fueled by commercial pressure, is that winning is the priority, transforming the sport into a calculated product where the rules are merely obstacles to be navigated.
The ultimate illustration of this utilitarian breakdown is the Thierry Henry handball incident. This was during the 2009 World Cup qualifier between France and Ireland. It's the perfect ethical case study.
The drama of the anecdote is crucial. France and Ireland are playing in a high-stakes match. In extra time, Henry clearly, intentionally, and illegally stopped the ball with his hand, a clear violation of a constitutive rule to set up the irregular winning goal.
And the referee missed it.
The referee missed it, France qualified, Ireland was eliminated.
And Henry's justification for this action is where the moral philosophy is just laid bare.
His reaction was, I played with my hand, but I'm not the referee. The most important thing is that we qualified. This is pure, unadulterated utilitarianism. It reduces the constitutive rules to mere formalism. He externalizes responsibility, implying that the rules only matter if they are sanctioned by the official. Winning is elevated to the highest ontological status, justifying the illegitimate means used to achieve it.
By using his hand, Henry violated virtually every ethical pillar we just listed.
He violated honesty explicitly, and he systematically destroyed justice. He negated equivalence, destroying distributive justice. He highlighted the procedural voids in the FIFA code by receiving no sanction. He violated retributive justice by escaping punishment. And he made no effort to rectify the harm to Ireland, destroying compensatory justice.
And the failure of the regulatory body, FIFA, to act just compounded the moral breach.
When FIFA concluded that they found no legal foundation for conducting the procedure, they effectively reinforced the dangerous doctrine that cheating is acceptable if not caught or sanctioned by the official. This institutional failure gives weight to the cynical mantra often attributed to Vince Lombardi. Winning is the only thing which is relevant.
We can apply Kant's categorical imperative here to expose the philosophical core of the wrongdoing.
Yes, the second formulation of the imperative states: act so that you use humanity always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Henry's action fundamentally failed this test. By cheating, he treated the constitutive rules, the concept of fair competition, and his opponent merely as means to his desired end victory. He used the integrity of the game as a tool, robbing the competition of its essential moral meaning.
This reduction of the game to a mere product echoes Albert Camus, who famously said he learned the meaning of ethics through sports.
Camus understood the integrity inherent in a shared set of rules. When commercialization transforms elite competition into a profitable product, the essence of the activity is spoiled. If rule breaking is accepted for a greater good, like ensuring a major nation qualifies, it delegitimizes the entire idea of competition. The integrity of sport demands that victory must be achieved by superior, honest performance within shared, public, and universally enforced standards, reflecting the equal moral status of all competitors.
Our final battleground takes us to the largest scale of all: globalization. The complexity of this topic demands a map, which David Held provides by classifying the dominant theoretical approaches.
Held defines globalization broadly as the process of extending, intensifying, accelerating, and increasing the importance of interconnectedness across economic, political, and cultural spheres. The core debate is whether this process represents benign global integration or something darker, a new form of hierarchy and control. We look at three schools: hyperglobalists, skeptics, and transformationalists.
The hyperglobalists take the most dramatic stance, arguing that we are entering a totally new era where the nation-state is obsolete.
They argue that globalization signals the end of the nation-state. The world is now defined by a truly integrated global economy, global capitalism, where strategic economic activities are imminently removed from state boundaries. Capital and financial institutions dictate organization, not national governments. And hyperglobalists forecast cultural homogenization, believing this interconnectedness will lead to the creation of a global citizenship and a homogenous McWorld.
They see it as an unavoidable, fundamental transformation.
Exactly, but the skeptics reject this entirely. They view globalization as largely a myth or simply an old story disguised by new technology.
What's their argument?
Skeptics contend that current economic integration is not unprecedented and is, in some ways, less integrated than the world of the late 19th century. They argue what we are witnessing is internationalization, meaning increased interaction between predominantly national economies, not a fully integrated global market. They emphasize that national governments remain the driving force, actively regulating and guaranteeing economic liberalization.
They also point to data showing that economic activity is highly concentrated regionally rather than globally dispersed.
This is the concept of triadization. They note that the overwhelming majority of trade, foreign investment, and economic activity circulates primarily between three core regions: North America, Europe, and the Pacific. This suggests the global corporation myth is misleading. These are often regionally focused entities operating internationally, not stateless global entities.
And regarding culture and inequality, the skeptics offer a much darker interpretation than the hyperglobalists' vision of cosmopolitanism.
Oh, much darker. Skeptics argue that internationalization deepens the North-South gap, leading to greater economic marginalization and exacerbating inequality. Culturally, instead of homogenization, they see fragmentation, fueling volatile nationalism and fundamentalism. They cite theories like Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and Barber's choice between McWorld and jihad.
This analysis leads the skeptics to a very potent political conclusion about institutions of global governance.
Yes. They view global institutions like the IMF, the WTO, and the entire structure of global governance not as instruments of collective progress, but as projects designed to maintain Western domination. They see the global economic order as structured dependence, not genuine interdependence. According to this skeptical view, globalization is merely recolonization in a new guise, maintaining deeply rooted forms of inequality and a strict hierarchy.
Finally, the transformationalist synthesis tries to find the middle ground, reflecting the true complexity that we've seen across all our source material today.
The transformationalists argue that globalization is neither a total myth nor a total collapse of the state. It is a massive historical force that is fundamentally reshaping societies, economies, and political institutions, necessitating a massive reorganization of the world order. It's an accelerating, profound process that demands new moral and political strategies to manage its interconnectedness. It's a pragmatic synthesis of integration and controlled change. Hashtag outro.
We've covered remarkable ground today, traversing multiple ethical dimensions where human capability violently clashes with moral consensus.
We saw the founding conflict in science, didn't we? Where the focus on practical utility must be consciously rebalanced with the need to return to wonder and moral responsibility. We analyzed the profound choices facing us in genetics, where the pursuit of genetic therapy battles the enormous risk of new eugenics and the cementing of biological inequality.
We explored the failure of international law to agree on fundamental definitions like human dignity, which resulted in the strategic ambiguity of the UN Declaration on Cloning. And we navigated the moral battle for non-human life, where the abstract principle of animal sentience struggles against the enduring power of economic interests.
And critically, we observed the systemic failure of justice on two very different scales. In global food systems, where technical abundance fails to eradicate hunger because political will and redistribution are lacking, and in competitive sports, where the commercial pursuit of victory transforms cheating into an acceptable utilitarian means, explicitly violating Kantian ethics.
We started with broad concepts, but the specific details, from Bacon's dilemma and the deliberate ambiguity of the phrase "inasmuch as" to Henry's handball and the paradox of global hunger, they show that these philosophical battles are not abstract. They are fought in the smallest, most concrete actions of daily life, policy interpretation, and technological application.
And we have seen repeated instances where political will and vested economic interest consistently override principled ethical consensus. The persistence of world hunger and the neutralization of the UN Declaration on Cloning prove that merely knowing the morally right path is insufficient. And that raises a final, provocative thought for you to consider.
The knowledge exists. The capability exists. We know the ideal ethical goal. Given that the technical solution to world hunger failed because of social inequality, and the ethical consensus on cloning failed because of political interpretation, what fundamental practical changes in our political and economic structures must occur first before humanity can live up to the bioethical ideals it professes? Is the problem ultimately scientific or organizational? And how can we force the latter to catch up to the former?